3 years after the battle at Valeth, the war between the Coalition and the Krithok Empire reached its turning point, and Selenra found herself standing on the bridge of Starbound, looking at tactical displays showing the largest fleet engagement in known history. 15 Coalition worlds had sent ships hundreds of vessels representing dozens of species united by shared belief that diversity made them stronger. Facing them across the void was the Krithok Armada. Twice as many ships, superior firepower, centuries of military doctrine. But lacking the one thing the Coalition had in abundance, the willingness to adapt and change. Maya wore her dress uniform for this battle. She said it felt appropriate given what was at stake. If they won today, the Krithok expansion would be stopped. If they lost, entire civilizations would fall to slavery. Selenra stood beside her captain wearing Coalition colors and feeling Emberclaw presence through the bond, and knowing that Ashwing was aboard another ship in the fleet, along with 47 other freed dragons who had joined their cause, the Krithok commander opened communications. His face appeared on screen, perfect features according to his species standards, cold eyes that saw all other beings as inferior. He offered one final chance for surrender. Said the Coalition could still avoid destruction by submitting to Krithok rule. Maya responded with a single word, no. The battle began. It was chaos on a scale Selenra had never witnessed. Ships moving in three-dimensional formations, weapons fire crossing millions of kilometers, shields flaring and failing, hulls breaching, lives ending, but also acts of incredible courage. Small frigate interposing itself between a dreadnought and a damaged cruiser. A wounded ship using its last power to evacuate crew from an ally. Fighters covering bomber runs with their own lives. This was what the Coalition meant. Not just alliance of convenience, but genuine willingness to sacrifice for others. Selenra and Emberclaw launched into the battle. They had done this dozens of times now, knew how to work together seamlessly. Wrong he consciousness, and became one being, moving through combat with deadly grace. They targeted a Krithok carrier. The kind of ship that held fighter wings and bombers, taking it out, would help turn the tide. But the carrier was heavily defended. Point defense systems tracked their approach. Fighter screens tried to intercept, heavier ships moved to block. Selenra felt Emberclaw determination. They had faced worse. They pressed the attack, dodged incoming fire, burned through fighter screens with fusion breath, closed on the carrier. Then Ashwing appeared beside them, and 12 other freed dragons. They had come to help, working together. They overwhelmed the carrier defenses, tore through its hull, destroyed its ability to launch attacks. The massive ship went dark and drifted, one target down, but the battle was far from over. Selenra coordinated with other dragon riders through psychic channels, directed attacks, shared tactical information, created strategies on the fly. The Coalition fleet began to adapt, using the dragons as mobile strike forces, hitting weak points. The Krithok did not expect, breaking formations, creating chaos in enemy ranks. The tide began to turn, slowly, painfully, but measurably. The Krithok started losing cohesion. Their rigid doctrine could not handle the unpredictable nature of Coalition tactics. Every species in the fleet fought differently, used different strategies, exploited different weaknesses. There was no single pattern to counter, no uniform approach to defend against. Then the Krithok commander made his mistake. Seeing his fleet struggling, he decided to target Selenra personally. He sent his entire reserve force after her. 6 dreadnoughts, all focused on one target. Trying to eliminate the symbol that held the Coalition together, Emberclaw sensed the danger, tried to evade. But there were too many ships, too many weapons. They got hit. Hard plasma, bolt burned through scales into flesh. Selenra felt pain explode through the bond, felt Emberclaw failing. They started falling, tumbling through space. But the Coalition did not abandon their own Starbound, and 20 other ships immediately moved to cover them, creating a defensive wall with their own hulls. taking fire meant for the wounded dragon. Maya's voice came through comms. She said, "Hold on. Syed, help was coming. Syed, do not give up." And Selenra, lying against Emberclaw neck, feeling his pain through the bond, and knowing he was badly hurt, made a choice. She opened the bond wider, pushed past all limits, called not just to Emberclaw but to every dragon in the fleet, asked for their strength, their power, their essence, and they answered Ashwing first, then the others, 48 dragons connecting to Selenra simultaneously, sharing their energy through psychic channels. Flowing power into Emberclaw's wounded body, healing him, strengthening him, making him something more. Emberclaw began to glow, brighter than ever before. His scales became pure light. His size increased beyond anything previously seen. He had become, for this moment, for this need, the embodiment of every freed dragon hope, every slave dream of liberation, every outcast wish for acceptance. He was all of them, together. He roared, and the sound carried across the entire battlefield made reality itself vibrate with power. The Krythok ships targeting him simply stopped their crews, overwhelmed by the psychic pressure, their systems disrupted by quantum frequency, their weapons unable to track something that existed partially outside normal space. Emberclaw struck back. Each blast of fusion breath destroyed a dreadnought completely. No shields could stop him, no armor could resist. In 90 seconds, all 6 targeting ships were gone. The Krythok fleet saw this, saw their reserves destroyed, saw their target transformed into an unstoppable force, and they broke. Ships began jumping to hyperspace, abandoning the battle, fleeing in disorder. The coalition fleet pursued, pressed the advantage, turned retreat into rout. Within an hour, the battle was over. The Krythok armada was scattered, their expansion stopped, their myth of invincibility shattered. Victory. Selenra disconnected from the mass bond slowly, carefully, thanking each dragon as she withdrew. Emberclaw returned to normal size, exhausted but alive, healing. They returned to Starbound together. The hangar erupted in cheers when they landed, crew members crowding around, celebrating, crying with relief. Maya pushed through the crowd. She looked at Selenra with tears in her eyes. She said, "You did it. You all did it." Selenra could barely stand. The psychic effort had drained her completely, but she smiled. Said, "We did it together." That was the point, always together. The celebration lasted for days, but Selenra's thoughts were elsewhere. She thought about her younger self. The tall girl standing alone in Crystal Gardens, believing she was broken, wrong, unworthy. If she could speak to that girl now, she would say, "You are not the problem. The problem is a world too small to see your value. But there are bigger worlds out there. People who will see you. Dragons who will choose you. Purposes that need exactly who you are. Stay strong. Stay true. Your difference is not a curse. It is your greatest strength. And one day you will stand on a starship bridge, surrounded by friends from 100 worlds, and you will help save entire civilizations because you refuse to be less than you." We're months after the great battle. Selenra returned to Valeth, not as a ward, not as an outcast, but as a hero, ambassador, symbol of everything they almost threw away. The council greeted her with honor. Lord Verantis himself, much older now and humbler than before, asked her to speak to the younger generation. She stood before thousands of young Valeth, including Lyrian, who was now training as a coalition pilot, and she told them her story, not hiding the pain, not pretending it was easy, but showing them that transformation was possible, that societies could change, that individuals could rise, that difference could become strength. A young Valeth boy raised his hand, asked if she ever wished she had been normal. Selenra smiled, said, "I used to wish that every day. But now, I would not change anything, because being normal would have meant missing everything that mattered. The struggles made me strong. The rejection taught me compassion. The loneliness prepared me to value true friendship. And my difference, my height that you all feared, that became the thing that helped me stand tall when it mattered most. She looked at young Lyrian, at the boy who asked the question, at all the faces watching her, and she said, "You are all enough exactly as you are. Do not shrink yourself to fit spaces too small for your spirit. Find bigger spaces, build them if you have to, and fill them with your light." The speech was broadcast across the coalition. Billions heard it. Millions were changed by it, and slowly, world by world, society by society, the old fears began to fade, replaced by new understanding that diversity was not weakness, it was survival, it was strength, it was the future. Selenra returned to Starbound. To her real home, Maya met her at the airlock. Asked how it felt going back, Selenra said it felt like closing a chapter. The Valeth would be fine now. They were learning, growing, becoming something better. But her place was here, among the stars, among friends who chose her, fighting for a galaxy where everyone could belong. Maya smiled, said she was glad to hear it, because there was a new mission, a planet requesting help, people who needed them. Selenra said, "When do we leave?" Maya said, "Tomorrow, but tonight, we celebrate." So they did. The crew gathered in the common room, humans and Valeth and a dozen other species, eating together, laughing together, being together. Emberclaw curled up near the viewport, Ashwing beside him, other dragons scattered throughout the ship, all of them chosen, all of them free, all of them home, and Selenra, standing among her people, her real people, the ones who saw her, valued her, loved her for exactly who she was. She felt complete, not because she had changed, but because she had finally found where she belonged, and that made all the difference. The first year aboard Starbound taught Selenra what it meant to belong somewhere without conditions or requirements beyond being herself and working hard and treating others with respect. And these simple expectations felt revolutionary after a lifetime of impossible standards that changed depending on who was judging her. Maya assigned her to the diplomatic corps after watching her natural ability to understand different perspectives and find common ground between conflicting parties, and Selenra discovered she had talent for negotiation that came from years of reading subtle social cues to avoid conflict back home. She helped broker 3 trade agreements in her first 6 months. She prevented 2 wars through careful mediation. She became someone the crew relied on and respected. Emberclaw, meanwhile, had become something of a legend. Other ships in the Coalition fleet would request his presence during dangerous missions because his ability to fight in space and survive impossible conditions made him invaluable, and he seemed to enjoy the work, as long as Selenra came with him. They developed new combat techniques, wrong-he consciousness, for brief intense periods during battle, coordinating attacks with human ships, creating defensive shields around damaged vessels, rescuing crew from disabled ships. Every mission added to their reputation, but it also attracted attention they did not want. The Krythok Empire had not forgotten their humiliation at the Valeth system, and they especially had not forgotten the dragon and his bonded partner, who had destroyed 6 dreadnoughts and sent the rest fleeing. Intelligence reports indicated the Krythok were hunting for Selenra. Specifically, they wanted to capture her and study the bond, maybe weaponize it for themselves. Maya called Selenra to her office one evening and showed her the reports. She said they could assign Selenra to safer duties, keep her away from frontline combat, reduce her visibility. Selenra looked at the intelligence files and felt cold certainty settle in her bones. She said no. If the Krythok wanted her, they would come regardless of where she hid, and she would rather face them on her terms with her friends around her than be caught unprepared somewhere supposedly safe. Maya studied her face for a long moment. Then she nodded and said she expected that answer, but had to offer the option. 2 weeks later, the trap was sprung. Starbound responded to a distress call from a coalition medical ship under attack near the border zone, and when they arrived, they found 3 Krythok heavy cruisers waiting in ambush. The medical ship was bait. The real target was Salenra. Maya realized this immediately and ordered emergency jump to hyperspace, but the Krythok had deployed interdiction fields that prevented faster-than-light travel, and the only way out was through them. The battle was fierce and desperate. Starbound shields held against the initial barrage, but barely returned fire damaged one cruiser, but the other 2 pressed the attack. Kira reported multiple hull breaches. Marcus said engines were at 60%. Claire transmitted from Medical Bay that casualties were coming in. Salenra made her decision. She told Maya she was going out. Maya started to argue, but Salenra cut her off gently. She said this was what she and Emberclaw trained for. This was why they existed, to protect people who could not protect themselves. Maya looked at her with fear and pride mixed together. She said, "Be careful," Salenra promised she would try. The hangar opened and Salenra and Emberclaw launched into space. The dragon expanded to his full combat size, massive and burning with golden fire. The Krythok immediately shifted their focus to him. They wanted him alive, wanted Salenra alive. So their weapons switched to capture beams and stasis fields instead of lethal plasma. This was their mistake. Emberclaw was built to resist such things. His species had fought against technological weapons for millennia and evolved defenses. The capture beams slid off his scales like water. The stasis fields collapsed against his psychic shields. He roared and attacked. But these Krythok were prepared better than last time. They had studied the battle at Valeth. They knew his capabilities, and they had brought a secret weapon. From the largest cruiser emerged a creature, another dragon, but twisted, modified with cybernetic implants and neural controls, enslaved and weaponized, forced to fight against its will. Salenra felt Emberclaw horror through the bond. This was wrong. Unnatural evil. The enslaved dragon attacked with mechanical precision. No joy in combat. No freedom in movement, just cold-programmed responses. Emberclaw met the attack reluctantly. He did not want to hurt another of his kind. But the cyborg dragon gave him no choice. They clashed in space, fusion breath against modified plasma weapons, claws against cybernetic armor, ancient instinct against forced programming. Salenra felt every impact through the bond, felt Emberclaw pain and rage and sorrow. She pushed deeper into the fusion state, became one with him completely. Together they fought with everything they had, but the cyborg dragon was strong. Enhanced by technology, tireless, relentless. They were losing. Then Salenra had an idea. She reached out through the bond, not to Emberclaw, but to the other dragon, tried to touch whatever remained of its original consciousness beneath the programming. At first, there was nothing. Just cold, mechanical responses. But she pushed deeper, gentle, persistent, calling to the trapped mind, and finally, faintly, she felt something respond, a flicker of awareness, a spark of the being it used to be before the Krythok took it. She spoke to that spark, told it she understood being trapped, being controlled, being treated as less than a person. She offered freedom, offered choice, offered hope. The cyborg dragon faltered. Its attacks became less precise. The programming fought against emerging consciousness. But Salenra held on, kept calling to that buried self. Emberclaw understood what she was doing and added his voice to hers. 2 dragons calling to a third, inviting it home to itself. The Krythok realized what was happening. They sent override commands, increased neural control. But it was too late. The dragon consciousness had awakened, and it was angry. The cyborg dragon turned on its masters, tore into the cruiser that had enslaved it, ripped through armor with claws designed to be weapons, burned through systems with breath weapons meant for conquest. The Krythok ship tried to retreat, but the freed dragon was merciless. It destroyed the vessel completely. Then it turned to Salenra and Emberclaw. For a moment she feared it might attack them too, but instead it bowed its great head. Gratitude flowed through psychic channels. Thanks for freedom. For remembering it was a person. For caring enough to reach out. Selenra asked its name through the bond. The dragon thought for a moment, then decided Ashwing. For the ashes of its old enslaved self and the wings it would use to fly free. The other two Krythok cruisers, seeing their secret weapon turned against them, and their sister ship destroyed, decided retreat was better than revenge. They jumped to hyperspace, left the battlefield, admitted defeat. Selenra and Emberclaw and Ashwing returned to Starbound together. The hangar barely fit all three dragons. Maya met them with her entire senior staff. She looked at Ashwing with concern and curiosity. Selenra explained what happened. How they freed a slave, how they gained an ally, how they proved that bonds could be created through choice and compassion instead of force and control. Claire wanted to examine Ashwing and remove the cybernetic implants if possible. The dragon agreed. Over the next weeks, they worked carefully, removing technology, healing wounds, restoring what the Krythok had taken, and Ashwing began to change scales that had been dull gray, brightened to deep purple eyes that had been empty, filled with life. A being that had been a weapon became a person again. Selenra spent hours with Ashwing, teaching meditation techniques, sharing her own experiences of feeling trapped, helping the dragon build new identity beyond what had been forced on it. They became friends. And eventually Ashwing asked if there were others, other beings rescued from Krythok slavery, other people learning to be themselves again. Selenra said yes, there were many. The coalition maintained rehabilitation centers, safe places for freed slaves to heal and recover. Ashwing wanted to help, wanted to work with others who had been through similar trauma. Maya arranged for specialist training. Ashwing became a therapist, a counselor for rescued slaves, someone who understood their pain firsthand. And Selenra, watching this transformation, realized something important. The best way to heal from trauma was not to forget it, but to use it to help others, to turn pain into purpose, to transform what had been done to you into fuel for making the world better. She thought about young Lyrian back on the Valeth homeworld, thought about all the people across the galaxy who felt broken or wrong or less than. And she decided to do more, to be more, to use her story to change things. She started speaking at coalition events, telling her journey, explaining how she went from outcast to hero, not by changing who she was, but by finding people who valued who she was. Her speeches inspired thousands. Other marginalized beings found courage. Other outcasts found hope. The coalition grew stronger, more diverse, more resilient, and the Krythok Empire. Watching all this began to fear. Because unity built on acceptance was stronger than control built on conformity, and they were starting to lose. The council chambers felt smaller than Selenra remembered as she stood before the assembled leadership with Maya beside her and Kira and Marcus flanking them, and Emberclaw sitting at her feet with golden eyes fixed on Lord Varantis in a way that promised violence if anyone threatened his bonded partner. Lord Varantis spoke first in his melodic voice that usually commanded respect, but now just sounded hollow and weak to Selenra ears after everything she had experienced, and he said that the council acknowledged their assessment of her condition had been premature and perhaps overly harsh. Selenra repeated the word condition slowly. She said, "You mean my height. The thing you have used to make me feel broken since I was a child." Varantis looked uncomfortable, and another council member named Lady Sophinia leaned forward and said they recognized their cultural values had been too rigid, and in light of Selenra's heroic actions, they were prepared to offer her full citizenship and a position of honor and maybe even a seat on the council itself. Maya made a sound that was half laugh and half cough. Selenra just stared at them. She said they were offering her a seat at the table of people who had tried to trade her like property to save themselves, and who had contacted the Krythok and given them intelligence about human defensive positions, hoping the enemy would destroy the troublesome outsiders and leave the Valeth alone. The council chamber went silent. Every member froze. Selenra continued and said, "Yes, we know about your betrayal because the Krythok broadcast their intelligence sources on subspace channels, and the humans intercepted it, and now everyone knows that the Valeth Council sold out an entire species who came in good faith just because you were afraid they might challenge your social order." Varantis' face lost all color. He started to say something about assurances they had been given. Maya interrupted, and her voice was hard as steel when she said the council members were fools because the Krythok never honor deals with species they consider inferior, and they would have taken the intelligence and destroyed the humans and then enslaved the Valeth anyway. She said the only reason the Valeth were still free was because Selenra, who they deemed genetically unworthy, had risked her life to protect a world that never protected her. Sophia said desperately that they wished to make amends. She asked Selenra to name her price. Selenra took a deep breath and felt Emberclaw's support through the bond and his absolute confidence in her. She said, "I want you to change, not just apologize, but actually fundamentally change. I want the laws that mark individuals as wards due to physical differences abolished completely. I want height restrictions on pairing removed from all legal codes. I want every Valeth who has been pushed to the margins because they did not fit your arbitrary standards to be given full rights and full citizenship without conditions." Varantis protested that such changes would require complete restructuring of their entire society. Selenra said yes, it would, and that was the price of their survival. She explained that Maya Coalition would keep growing and the galaxy would keep changing, and if the Valeth did not evolve with it, they would be left behind, not through conquest, but through becoming irrelevant. Maya added that humans were still willing to offer Valeth membership in the Coalition, but not under the current government that tried to betray them, and they needed leadership that valued all people, not just those who fit specific aesthetic ideals. The council members looked at each other, trapped between their pride and the practical reality of their situation. Finally, Varantis bowed his head. He said it would take time, but they would begin the reforms. He gave his word. Selenra said his word meant very little to her, but she would accept it as a starting point because, unlike the council, she believed in second chances and that beings could change, even ones who had hurt her deeply. She turned to leave. Then she paused and looked back. She said one more thing. She was leaving with the humans. She had been offered a position as cultural liaison and tactical specialist aboard the Starbound, and she and Emberclaw had found their place, and it was not here anymore. Sophia's voice was shocked when she asked if Selenra would abandon her people. Selenra said quietly that no, the people had abandoned her years ago, and she was just finally accepting that she deserved better than barely being tolerated. She deserved to be somewhere she was celebrated. She walked out of the council chambers with her head high, and Maya and the others around her like an honor guard, and Emberclaw trotted beside her, radiating satisfaction. Outside, the streets were crowded with Valeth who had heard about the battle. For the first time in her entire life, they looked at Selenra with something other than contempt or pity. They looked at her with awe. A young Valeth girl, maybe 16 cycles old, pushed through the crowd. She was tall. Not as tall as Selenra, but clearly above the approved height range. Her eyes were wet with tears. She whispered that Selenra had shown them. Shown everyone that different does not mean broken. Selenra knelt down to eye level with the girl. She asked her name. The girl said, "Lyrian." Selenra took Lyrian's hands and said, "Listen to me carefully. You are not broken. You are not a mistake. The way you are made is perfect, because it is yours, and anyone who tells you otherwise is the one who needs to change, not you." Then she stood and addressed the entire crowd. She said she had spent her whole life believing she was wrong and needed to be fixed, but she was never the problem. The problem was a society so afraid of difference that it could not see strength standing right in front of them. She gestured to Emberclaw. She said this dragon could have been killed as an egg, but instead became the weapon that saved this world. She said she could have been corrected or hidden away, but instead became the person who wielded that weapon. Our differences are not weaknesses, she told them. They are our greatest advantages if we are brave enough to embrace them. The crowd absorbed her words in silence. Maya stepped up beside her. She said the coalition stood ready to accept any Valeth who felt they did not fit in current society. They were building something new where every being had a place, regardless of appearance or who they loved or what made them unique. Everyone was welcome. Over the following weeks, change began on the Valeth homeworld. It was slow and frustrating and imperfect, but the council, faced with losing their best people to emigration, started dismantling old restrictions. Height became irrelevant in pairing calculations. Genetic anomalies were reclassified as variations. Individuals who had been wards became full citizens. 43 Valeth, including young Lyrian, chose to join coalition training programs. They wanted to be like Selenra, proud of differences, strong in uniqueness. Selenra thrived aboard the Starbound. Her height, which had been a curse, was barely noteworthy among a crew from dozens of different worlds. She became Maya, right hand in diplomatic negotiations. Her unique perspective helped bridge cultural gaps. Emberclaw grew stronger with each passing cycle. He and Selenra discovered they could share consciousness briefly during combat, creating a tactical unit unlike anything the Coalition had seen. Other dragon-bonded individuals emerged across the galaxy, inspired by their example. 6 months after the battle, Maya found Selenra in the observation deck watching stars. She asked if Selenra was homesick. Selenra said no, with surprise that it was true. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. For the first time in her life, she was home. Maya smiled and said they had been invited to a diplomatic function on another world next month, formal affair. Lots of dancing. Selenra grinned and said she hoped they had high ceilings, because she would hate to hit her head. They laughed together. 2 women from different worlds who found friendship in the vast darkness. Emberclaw dozed nearby and sent contentment through the Bond family, he seemed to say, "Pack home." Selenra whispered yes, while stroking his scales, home. Outside the viewport, stars stretched endlessly, a galaxy full of worlds where beings of all types were learning that strength comes not from being the same, but from standing together, despite differences. And somewhere on the Valeth homeworld, a tall girl named Lyrian looked at those same stars and smiled, knowing she too could be extraordinary. Not despite what made her different, but because of it. The Krythok ships appeared in space like dark mountains blocking out the stars, and their hulls were covered in weapons that could destroy entire cities in single strikes. And Selenra watched through the observation deck windows as 12 massive vessels took positions around the planet and began broadcasting their message on all frequencies. The translation came through cold and mechanical, saying that all beings in this system had been evaluated and found genetically inferior and must surrender technology and prepare for subjugation or face extinction, and the voice held no emotion at all, like this was simply a fact being stated, rather than a threat. Maya stood at the command center surrounded by her crew and gave orders in a calm, steady voice that somehow made the panic. Selenra felt ease just slightly, and Kira reported that shields were at maximum and weapons were charged, but there were 12 enemy dreadnoughts against their 1 ship. Marcus said the odds were bad. Maya said they would make themselves count anyway. Selenra felt Emberclaw shift beside her, and through their bond she sensed his power building and responding to the threat, and he was growing larger right there in the observation deck, and his scales blazed with golden fire that lit up the entire room. She had never seen him this big before. He was the size of a shuttle now and still growing, and somehow the bond between them was amplifying his natural abilities in ways she did not understand, but could feel happening. And she placed her hand on his neck and felt heat that should have burned her, but instead felt comfortable and right. Maya turned to her and said they could still evacuate her to safety. Selenra said no. She explained that star dragons were creatures of legend and were bred for battle thousands of years ago, and Emberclaw was responding to the threat the way his species had always responded, and she could feel his certainty through the bond that he could fight in space and survive and be effective. Maya looked skeptical. Selenra said, "Trust me," and meant it with everything she had. The battle started when the Krythok opened fire, and massive plasma bolts crossed the distance and slammed into starbound shields, making them flare bright blue. And the entire ship shook from impacts, and Kira reported shield strength dropping, and Maya ordered return fire. The human weapons were precise and powerful, and found weak points in Krythok armor, but there were so many enemy ships and only one starbound. Selenra made her decision. She told Maya to open the starboard hangar. Maya asked what she was planning. Selenra explained that dragons could survive in vacuum and breathe nuclear fusion and swim through solar coronas, and in space they were gods, and she and Emberclaw together could help turn this battle. Maya said she would die out there. Selenra said no, they would transcend. Before anyone could stop her, she ran for the hangar with Emberclaw following, and his claws sparked on the metal deck, and when they reached the airlock she paused just long enough to look back at Maya and say, "Thank you for seeing me as I am." Then she hit the emergency release. Space embraced them. The cold should have killed her instantly, but Emberclaw expanded around her and created a bubble of breathable atmosphere held together by psychic power and ancient magic that humans called impossible, but which worked anyway, and she was riding on his back as he grew even larger. He became massive, bigger than the starbound, bigger than any living thing she had ever seen. His scales burned with the light of captured stars, and when he opened his jaws and roared, the sound traveled through quantum frequencies that made reality itself vibrate. The Krythok turned their weapons on this new threat. Plasma bolts that could shatter continents hit Emberclaw's scales and bounced off like rain hitting stone, and he flew between the dreadnoughts, moving with impossible speed and grace for something so large, and Selenra felt his joy through the bond, because this was what he was made for. He opened his jaws again. What came out was not normal fire, but concentrated stellar fusion, the same reaction that powered suns. The nearest Krythok dreadnought shields evaporated under that assault, and the hull beneath began to melt, and secondary explosions bloomed across its surface as critical systems failed. Through their bond, Selenra felt Emberclaw ancient memories. His species had fought wars among the stars before her people even existed. They had defended worlds and burned fleets and earned their reputation as creatures of myth. And now that legacy lived in him. On the starbound, Maya watched in amazement and ordered all weapons to target the ships Emberclaw attacked and coordinate strikes, and the battle became a deadly dance of dragon fire and human precision. One dreadnought fell, then two, then three. But the Krythok adapted, and the remaining ships combined their fire and focused everything on Emberclaw, and even his incredible armor had limits, and Selenra felt pain lance through their bond as a plasma bolt found a gap between scales and burned the flesh beneath. She screamed, not in fear, but in rage. Something inside her broke open power. She did not know she possessed flooded through the bond and into Emberclaw, and her body began to glow with the same golden light as his scales, and the psychic connection between them deepened and became fusion. She was not riding the dragon anymore. She was the dragon. Their minds merged completely. Her tactical thinking guided his instincts, and his raw power amplified her determination. And together they became something entirely new, a weapon, a force of nature, a living star. They moved through the battlefield with devastating precision, and chose targets with her strategic mind, and executed attacks with his ancient skill, and the Krythok dreadnoughts fell one after another. 4 down, 5-6. The remaining enemy vessels broke formation. Their commanders finally understood that racial superiority meant nothing against beings who refused to fit into expected categories, and the last 6 dreadnoughts fled into hyperspace, leaving debris and defeat behind. Selenra felt the fusion dissolve gently. She and Emberclaw separated back into 2 beings, but changed forever by what they had shared. And she knew she would always feel him in her mind now, and he would always feel her. And they were bonded in ways that went beyond anything the Valeth had. Words for Emberclaw, now smaller but still large, glided back to the starbound hangar. The crew was waiting when they landed. Maya stepped forward and gave a sharp military salute. She said she had seen much bravery in her career, but what Selenra just did had saved the ship, and the planet and everyone aboard owed her their lives. Selenra felt tears on her face. She said she just could not let them die when they were the first people who made her feel like she mattered. Kira said firmly that she had always mattered. Marcus said it was the most incredible thing he had ever witnessed. The entire crew was nodding and smiling and looking at her with respect and admiration. Then a transmission came from the planet. Lord Verantis appeared on screen. His perfect features twisted with something that might have been shame. He said the Valeth Council requested an audience immediately. Maya's expression went cold, and she said she was sure they did. Selenra knew what was coming. The council would try to take credit or make excuses or find some way to turn this situation to their advantage, but she was done letting them control her story. She looked at Maya and said she would go face them. Together. As equals, Maya smiled and said together. Then they took a shuttle down to the surface with Kira and Marcus as honor guard, and Emberclaw rode with them, radiating protective energy through the bond. When they entered the council chambers, Selenra stood tall, taller than she ever had before, and for the first time in her life, she was not ashamed of her height. She was proud of it. Selenra stood alone in the crystal garden where other Valeth walked in pairs and groups, but never came near her, because she was different from them in a way that made them uncomfortable and sometimes angry at what they saw when they looked at her tall frame that rose 7 feet high while most of them barely reached 6 feet at their tallest. And this difference had marked her entire life as something wrong and broken according to the strict rules of her people, who valued sameness above all other qualities in their society. The silver towers of the Valeth capital city gleamed under twin suns and reflected light that hurt her eyes when she looked up. But she did anyway, because looking at the sky was better than seeing the stares and whispers that followed her everywhere she went in this place that should have been home but never felt like one. And beside her feet lay Emberclaw, who was a dragon with scales that shifted between red and gold, depending on his mood. And right now those scales showed deep orange, which meant he sensed her sadness through the bond they shared. She had found him as an egg, abandoned in volcanic rocks beyond the city limits. And when she touched the warm shell, something clicked inside both of them like 2 pieces of a puzzle fitting together perfectly for the first time. And when he hatched, his eyes opened and looked at her with recognition that said, "You are mine, and I am yours forever." And that was 3 seasons ago when everything changed, because the Valeth Council told her to give up the dragon or leave the city permanently. Dragons were wild things, according to Valeth wisdom, and wild things had no place in their ordered society, where everything followed rules that had existed for thousands of years without change, and they especially had no place bonded to someone like Selenra, who already broke their rules just by being too tall and therefore already suspect in ways she could not control or fix, no matter how hard she tried, and she had tried for many years before giving up, But she refused to abandon Emberclaw because he was the only being in the entire world who looked at her without judgment or disappointment or pity in his eyes, and when she said no to the council, they allowed her to stay only because killing her would have looked bad to the other cities, and the Valeth prided themselves on being civilized even when they were being cruel in quiet ways that left no visible marks. Then the humans arrived in a ship that came down from the stars like a falling moon. The ship was called Starbound, and it landed in the designated zone outside the city where foreign visitors were processed and evaluated before being allowed entry. And Selenra watched from a distance as the airlock opened, and beings emerged who looked somewhat like Valeth, but shorter and stockier, with skin in many different shades and hair in colors she had never seen before on any living creature. The one who led them was a woman named Maya Cross, who had dark brown skin and eyes that seemed to see everything at once without missing any detail, no matter how small, and she spoke Valethian through some kind of translation device that made the words sound slightly mechanical, but still understandable, and her voice carried authority that made even Lord Varantis pause before responding. Maya said they came seeking trade and cultural exchange and possible alliance against threats that existed in the wider galaxy beyond this small system, and the council listened with polite interest. But Selenra could tell they were not really interested in anything the humans offered because the Valeth believed themselves superior to most other species and did not think they needed outside help with anything important. Over the next few days, the humans explored the city and met with various officials, and Selenra watched them from safe distances, because she was curious about beings who seemed so different from each other, yet worked together without apparent conflict, and she noticed that they treated everyone the same way, regardless of rank or position, which was unusual and interesting. On the fourth day, she encountered Captain Maya in the market district. Selenra had been buying nutrients for Emberclaw when she saw the human woman examining carved stones at a vendor stall, and the vendor was explaining that these were bonding stones exchanged between paired mates as symbols of commitment, and Maya listened with genuine interest instead of the polite boredom most outsiders showed. Then Maya turned and saw Selenra standing there. The human woman looked up at her tall frame without any of the reactions Selenra had learned to expect, and instead she smiled and said, "Hello, I am Maya Cross," and extended her hand in what Selenra recognized as a human greeting gesture from the cultural briefings that had been distributed, and Selenra hesitated before taking that hand carefully. Maya asked about Emberclaw, who had emerged from behind Selenra to investigate this stranger, and the dragon approached without fear, which shocked Selenra because Emberclaw normally avoided everyone except her, and would sometimes snap at people who got too close. But now he was letting Maya touch his snout and making happy rumbling sounds. The vendor gasped, and other Valeth stopped to stare because dragons did not allow touch from anyone except their bonded partner, according to all known records. And yet here was Emberclaw pressing into Maya's hand, like a pleased cat, and his scales brightened to pure gold. Maya said you have a special bond with him, and asked how long they had been together, and Selenra found herself answering honestly instead of giving the brief, dismissive responses she usually used with strangers, and somehow they ended up walking together toward the human embassy while talking about dragons and loneliness and what it meant to be different. Maya told her about Earth, where humans came in countless varieties of height and color and ability, and how they had learned through painful history that diversity made them stronger, not weaker. And she said this with such conviction that Selenra felt something crack open inside her chest, where she had built walls to protect herself from constant rejection. They reached the embassy gardens, where human and Valeth plants grew side by side, and Emberclaw found a warm stone to curl up on, and Maya offered to show Selenra the human ship, if she wanted to see how humans built their communities and lived their lives. Selenra knew the council would disapprove of this. She knew accepting would mark her as even more of an outsider than she already was. she knew she should refuse politely and return to her small dwelling and continue living the careful, quiet life she had constructed to avoid making waves. But Maya was looking at her with such open kindness and genuine interest, and no judgment at all in those dark eyes. So, Selendra said yes. They arranged to meet the next morning, and as Maya walked away, Selendra stood in the garden with Emberclaw, and felt something she had not felt in years, and it took her a long moment to recognize the feeling as hope, which was dangerous and foolish, but also impossible to ignore. That night she barely slept, because her mind kept returning to Maya words about diversity and strength, and the idea that being different might not be a curse after all, but simply a fact that could be accepted or even celebrated, and this idea was so foreign to everything she had been taught that it felt like learning a new language. In the morning, she dressed carefully and met Maya at the designated coordinates, and together they boarded a shuttle that took them up to the starbound, and as they rose through the atmosphere, Selendra looked down at her world and saw it from outside for the first time, and from this distance it looked peaceful and perfect, and you could not see any of the pain or division or quiet cruelty that existed on its surface. The ship was amazing. Humans of every size and color moved through corridors with purpose and efficiency, and they greeted Selendra without staring at her height, and introduced themselves with friendly smiles, and Maya showed her the engine room and the medical bay and the observation deck where you could see stars in every direction. A woman named Kira with bright red hair said it was nice to meet her. A man named Marcus with dark skin and laughing eyes said Emberclaw was magnificent. A doctor named Claire asked permission to scan the dragon with scientific equipment and got so excited about the psychic bond that she started talking too fast for the translator to keep up. Selendra felt overwhelmed by all this acceptance. She had expected politeness at best and found something much deeper that felt almost like belonging, and it scared her because things that felt this good usually got taken away, and she had learned not to hope for permanence in anything good. Maya took her to the observation deck, and they stood looking at the planet below, and Maya said that every world had troubles, but some troubles were worth fighting against, and she asked Selendra if she knew about the Krithok Empire. Selendra did not know that name. Maya explained that the Krithok conquered worlds and enslaved or destroyed populations that did not meet their genetic standards, and they were expanding their territory, and eventually they would reach systems like this one, and the Valeth obsession with physical perfection would make them targets, not allies. Selendra felt cold fear settle in her stomach. Maya said she was building a coalition of worlds that valued individual rights and diversity and mutual defense, and she wanted the Valeth to join, but she was not sure the council would agree because they seemed too focused on maintaining their internal order to worry about external threats. Then Maya said something that changed everything. She said if things get dangerous, you should know that our ship would welcome you and Emberclaw always, and there was such sincerity in her voice that Selendra believed her completely. Before Selendra could respond, an alarm sounded, and a voice announced that Valeth Council was demanding her immediate return to the surface and claiming she had violated protocols by leaving without permission. Maya looked angry and said they did not own Selendra, but Selendra explained that by Valeth law, she was a ward of the council until age 30, or until she bonded with an approved mate, and she was only 23. So technically the council did have authority over her movements. Maya called this barbaric. Selendra called it her life. Then Maya told her something shocking. The council had approached the humans privately and offered to give Selendra to them permanently as a gift to sweeten the alliance negotiations because they saw her as an embarrassment they wanted to remove quietly. Selendra felt the words like physical blows. Maya had refused, of course, and told the council that humans did not trade in people, but she was offering Selendra asylum if she wanted it, and a place on the crew and freedom to make her own choices. Selendra stood there trying to process this information and feeling Emberclaw's certainty through their bond that these humans were trustworthy and good. Then the ship alarms blared louder. A new voice, urgent and stressed, announced that massive vessels were entering the system and broadcasting threats and demanding surrender. The Krythok had arrived. Maya's face went pale, and she started issuing orders, and Selenra realized with terrible clarity that someone had betrayed the humans and told the Krythok where to find them. The council had sold out the humans, hoping the Krythok would destroy these troublesome visitors and leave the Valeth alone, and now everyone was going to pay the price for that betrayal.